I'm Mike Papantonio, and this is Ring of Fire. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder told us recently that some banks are just too big to prosecute. Those are his words. Investigative journalist Brad Friedman is going to be here to tell us why Holder is dead wrong. And drug companies got a huge boost from Obama this past week, and we'll discuss why this administration believes that drug companies should be immune from lawsuits over their dangerous products. Violent acts from Tea Party groups are reaching new highs in America. We'll hear what the Southern Poverty Law Center has to say about the rise of the right-wing hate machine. All that and more coming up. And right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
According to the Justice Department, the banks that crippled our economy are simply too big and too important to prosecute. Even with all the evidence of how they stole from investors and defrauded government and illegally foreclosed on millions of homes, Eric Holder says they're untouchable. Joining me now to talk about Holder's ridiculous claim is investigative journalist Brad Friedman. Brad, we have a Department of Justice that's willing to go after the mob. They're willing to go after Aaron Swartz. They're willing, when they go after a big investigation, to have ongoing grand juries when they investigate the mob. They issue special subpoenas. They wiretap, but not with the big banks. According to Eric Holder, they're just too big. We can't push them around like we do everybody else in America. What's your take on that?
He's made it clear that we have a two-tiered justice system, and it was rather remarkable to hear him actually say it out loud and then go on to pretend that he was concerned about the fact that we've got these banks that he says are too big to jail. It's remarkable to me. Mike, you're an attorney. You know the law better than me, but as far as I know, I am unfamiliar with any provisions in the law that says that if it's going to have an adverse effect on the world economy, there is nothing you can do about it. That you have to let these banks have a get out of jail free card. It was absolutely remarkable to hear that from the nation's top law enforcement official.
Brad, didn't Elizabeth Warren get it right? She said, "Look, let me look at these facts. First of all, you have HSBC, who engaged in money laundering for terrorists, for drug cartels. They did it not just once, but they were warned not to do it, and then they did it again. And then they were warned again, don't do it, and then they did it again. And nevertheless, very clear that any one of the people that made that decision could have gone to jail and there could have been some punishment like we punished other criminals, and it would not have affected the banking industry at all. Isn't this argument by Eric Holder just an absurd red herring? It has nothing to do with the truth here, does it?
I can't say whether or not it would have affected the banking industry, as you suggest. It might have. If it would have, that's the reason for the DOJ to do their job. It is the job of the DOJ to break up monopolies, to break up banks that are too big, banks, businesses. I mean, can you imagine breaking up AT&T the way they did under Ronald Reagan, for crying out loud, 20, 30 years ago? Can you imagine something like that happening today? I can't, and yet the laws really haven't changed. So Elizabeth Warren is absolutely right. They throw folks in jail for an ounce of cocaine. They'll throw them in jail for life if it happens more than a few times. With HSBC, they were warned. And they were laundering hundreds of millions of dollars, at least that we know of, as she said, and yet nothing was done. But it's not just the banks, Mike. We saw the same thing with BP, where you had 11 different manslaughter. They pleaded guilty to 11 different cases of manslaughter in the BP, the oil leak in the Gulf, and yet nobody went to jail.
Brad, isn't the problem, Brad? First of all, people commit crimes. Corporations don't commit crimes. people commit crimes. So it's simply a matter of the Department of Justice making the FBI do what they're supposed to do, and that is to wiretap. That is to do what they call it's called pyramid structure. You start at the bottom, you indict the people at the bottom, they talk about the people right above them, that person. It's like a food chain until you get to the top. That's what RICO is for. That's how we went after the mobs. But here you have a Department of Justice that is they're so driven by this notion that comes directly from Eric Holder. Believe me, it comes from the top. But the real question, Eric, for Eric Holder is, does it come from the president? Is the president the one saying, gee, you know what, Eric? Let's not go after these banks. Let's not go after Wall Street. Let's not really go after BP. Let's not go after the drug companies because, by God, we get a lot of money for them in our election cycle. Isn't that, when you drill down, isn't that what we're talking about here?
Well, there has to be some explanation. And you say, they have these ways of working their way up, through the crime syndicate. In this case, they don't even need to. They've got the crime syndicate. The crime syndicates are pleading guilty in these cases. They're just not facing any real accountability. Why this is going on is still an open question. Is it because of HSBC giving a lot of money during the campaigns to the Obama administration? I don't know. There have been other corporations that haven't donated to the Obama administration that also got off scot-free.
Brad, listen, the rationale is if we go after a bank like HSBC, who has money laundered money for the drug cartels, it's no question they pled guilty to it. Yes, we did that. We broke the law. Nobody went to jail. Now, the argument is we can't do anything to this bank because it's going to affect commerce. Isn't that the same thing as saying, well, if you want to take that rationale, we can't break up drug dealerships all throughout the United States because they put money in the economy too. When the drug dealer ends up selling an ounce of Coke on the street corner, he maybe takes that and he goes and buys groceries. He goes, maybe buys a television set, maybe buys a car. It's the same type of ridiculous rationale that most Americans are scratching their head and saying, what in the hell are you talking about, Mr. Attorney General? I mean, what am I missing here, Brad?
I don't think you're missing anything. That's what's so troubling about this. And this, by the way, is not even one of these Republican Democratic issues. I think for the most part, all of America is looking at these issues, at least when they hear about it. The media doesn't seem to talk about it as much as they should, but they're looking at these issues and saying, what the hell is going on? And the fact is, you've got Republicans in Congress who are not really doing anything about it. Chuck Grassley was the one who asked that question to Eric Holder, so he gets some credit for that. But I think we're all kind of scratching our heads saying, what the hell is going on? This has been 5 years or so since the global economic meltdown because of these people. And no one is facing accountability. And the top law enforcement official in this country is saying, yes, I'm concerned about it.
Early on in the last presidential cycle, there was some element forming up where you had the people running against Obama that had a series of ads. Now, they abandoned the ads, but they would have won with this ad, I'm convinced. The ad is, let me get this right, Mr. President. The Wall Street has stolen, at the very minimum, $13 trillion away from the American public, and you haven't indicted anybody. You haven't even brought a grand jury to look at this across the board. Not one grand jury. You haven't really even pursued this, but you had all this money stolen from the American public. There was an ad campaign that was forming up, and I don't know if you followed it early on, but I don't know if it was grassroots or whatever, but that was a campaign issue that would have clobbered this president had the Republicans had enough sense to stick with that, but they didn't. So now the issue is emerging again, and this is something that if he doesn't get it under control, it could haunt his entire next 4 years as president, don't you think?
Oh, there's no question it's going to haunt him. The question is whether he's going to change course. But, this has been a problem from day one. And those of us progressives have been out yelling and screaming about it. Even some of the folks on the right have been yelling and screaming about it. It seems to have no effect on him. And now you're looking at Eric Holder as, one of the very few top officials in the Obama administration who is sticking around for a second term as if he's being rewarded for not doing his job in the first term. It remains, I think, one of the great mysteries of the Obama administration, unless you want to take the idea that, this is all sort of a quid pro quo, campaign payoffs and so forth. But that doesn't even make sense because he has given that same protection to a lot of corporations who were not campaign supporters. So I got to tell you, I think you're scratching your head trying to figure this out. I'm trying to do the same thing. I don't think we yet have any answers on why he's doing it. But we know he is doing it, and we know that these guys are getting away literally with murder, as in the case of BP.
Okay, so what we see in this situation, we have an industry phoning up documents where they're actually taking white out, changing the names of people on mortgages, making up names, making up complete fantasy stories about somebody that's trying to acquire a mortgage, actually going and signing on their behalf. And they're admitting, yes, we committed fraud. The other situation with HSBC where they admit, yes, we involved ourselves with money laundering, with the drug cartels, with potential terrorists, people who are trying to kill people on American soil. We laundered their money, and yes, we do plead, and the company is still doing business right here in the United States, and Eric Holder has done zero, absolutely nothing to make sure that anybody's held accountable. In 1 minute, what makes all this change? Give me an idea. 1 minute, according to Brad Friedman, how do we ever change this culture of crime that seems to go all the way to Washington, D.C.?
We change it the same way we change absolutely everything, which is for the public to raise holy hell, and then if raising holy hell does no good, throwing the bums out. The problem is the Democrats, and the Democrats know this, they've got such an insane, crazy party on the right in the Republicans that they're basically saying to their base, oh, you don't like us? Go, feel free, go for the other guys. They know that people are not going to go for the other guys, but when the right and the Republicans, and you're hearing this a bit from, sort of the libertarian faction, the Rand Pauls and so forth, who are saying, wait a minute, this too big to fail notion, has got to stop. If the right begins to pick up on this problem, begins to raise hell about it, then you might see some action from this Democratic president. As usual, you only get action from this Democratic president when it will make the Republicans happy, it seems.
Brad Friedman, keep following this story. We'll keep talking to you about it. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, brother.
Just ahead, we'll talk about more ways that the Obama administration is working against the civil justice system. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
The odds of becoming a successful NASCAR driver? 1 in 125 billion. The odds of a child being diagnosed with autism? 1 in 110.
Jamie McMurray encourages you to learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Several years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court granted a level of immunity to generic drug makers. Recently, the court heard arguments on a case that would extend that immunity. The Obama administration has made it clear that they're going to support this immunity, and I've got attorneys Howard Nations and Michael Burg with me now to follow the Obama money trail on this drug maker decision. Howard, it's amazing to me that every time we believe that this president is there for consumers or for the average American, he surprises us again. It's almost like his lips are moving, he's telling us what we want to hear, but then he does just the opposite of what matters. Howard, talk about the Bartlett case. I want both you and Mike to give your impressions and see if they're the same as mine about this administration.
Well, Karen Bartlett is a 56-year-old woman who did what a lot of other Americans do. She had shoulder pain, and she went out and bought a very simple anti-inflammatory that was prescribed by her doctor. They're called NSAIDs, and it's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. It's the same thing. Most popular one is ibuprofen. This particular one was a generic form of Clinaril, which is known as Sulindac. Now, what happened is this woman who went in for simple pain relief in her shoulder developed this toxic epithermal necrolysis, and she spent 2 months in a burned unit, which her doctor described at the trial as being hell on earth.
Basically, Howard, if I got it right, her skin simply burns off. Is that correct?
She lost 2/3 of her skin, she damaged her lungs, and most importantly, despite 13 eye operations, she's now legally blind.
Okay, let me go to Mike. Mike, let me ask you, now we have this administration who is saying that the case is before the Supreme Court as to whether or not we should let this drug company get away with almost killing this woman, a horrible, horrible injury. Her body basically burned up. She's in the hospital. Damages come back. I think a jury awards him $21 million, which still doesn't capture the suffering this woman went through. The case is going up to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, the Obama administration is siding with the drug companies. Really?
Mike, let me first tell you. Well, number one, I've had cases with Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and the burning occurs from the inside out. Any doctor who's in a burn unit is going to tell you it's the most painful burns you can have. It burns off the skin inside out. This woman suffered terribly. The Supreme Court and this administration have bonded together to make sure consumers don't have rights in the legal system and have access to get damages like this from pharmaceutical companies. This case and the Mensing case are the example of that. These Supreme Court justices are there for the pharmaceutical companies, for the big corporations, and the administration is in line with them to keep consumers from being able to get compensation for injuries that are serious like this. It's awful.
Howard, let me ask, how could we have been so wrong about this president, Howard? I mean, how is it that we have been so wrong in gauging what this president is really about where it comes to taking care of consumers?
Well, what's so shocking about this particular case, Mike, is the fact that in the original opinion, which Mike just alluded to, the Mensing case, the Attorney General or the administration sided with the plaintiff in that case and asked that the state law prevail over the FDA rulings. In this case,
in other words, they sided against the drug companies, sided against the FDA, and actually were there on behalf of consumers, which is exactly the opposite of this case, correct?
Right, and this is exactly the same case. It's the same issue. It's whether the state law should prevail over the federal FDA regulation. That was the same issue precisely in Mensing. But in this case, it's about a design defect. In the previous case, it was about failure to warn. And the administration is going against the consumer in this case.
Well, to make this simple, Mike, let me go to you, where this woman is left with almost her entire body burned up. The company absolutely knew that there was the potential for this happening, but they underwarned. You know, if you take a look at the warning, they don't say, oh, by the way, this product can cause all the skin on your body to simply slough off, and you have to have skin grafts over 90% of your body. But in this situation, this woman, if the U.S. Supreme Court rules in a predictable way, because this is the 1% Supreme Court, they are there for corporate America, they're not there for consumers. But if they rule against this woman, what the message is that if you take a generic drug and the generic kills you, that you don't have the right to proceed because you're protected with some type of absurd immunity that has been trumped up by this administration and by the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
did I get that
absolutely.
right?
What they're saying is you're on your own. You're on your own. You're stuck with your medical bills. You're going to end up being on the tax rolls. You're going to be there trying to get through your life as this woman, Mrs. Bartlett's going to be doing it. And what really has happened here is the pharmaceutical companies' money and power have bought their way into our Supreme Court and into this administration. This is something that we have to stop. And the American people have to stop, and we need to make sure that the voice is being heard, which is, look, we're not going to let the pharmaceutical companies go out and kill people, and we're not going to have any recourse.
Howard, you and Mike are in front of judges all over America all the time, in front of with the biggest cases in this country. Would you please tell me how often you see a situation where the FDA has absolutely been just joined at the hip with a pharmaceutical company that is committing fraud, that's committing perjury in the way they go about presenting their case, that's covering up, phoning up clinical data? I mean, isn't this a scene that you and Mike see day after day, time and time again?
Unfortunately, you're right, Mike. This is a scene that we see all the time. And the sad part about this is this doesn't have to go to the Supreme Court, and it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court does with the Bartlett decision, because the FDA itself, which is part of the executive branch, which is under the President of the United States, the FDA can make all of this go away and reinstate the right of 80% of drug users. Understand, generic drugs, what they're wiping out, generic drugs are 80% of the drug sales in America. The FDA can change all this with a simple one-page rule change, and they have failed and refused to do it.
You met with the head of the FDA about this, didn't you, Howard? You and Mike Burg has been involved in the same thing. But tell me how your meeting went with the FDA in this regard.
Well, we met with Health and Human Services, and we had very good response from the Health and Human Services. But when it gets over to the FDA has really stalled on it, and it's been pending for quite a while now, and there's an application pending by Public Citizen that they need to act on, which specifically is requesting this as a safety issue. This is a major safety issue, and they've refused to act on this as a safety issue. All this takes is a one-page rule change, and you can believe it will never get through a Republican Congress. And if it doesn't get through the Supreme Court, which it probably won't, it's going to fall back to the FDA, back to the executive branch. And if they don't act, then rights of 80% of drug users in this country are obliterated. And you never know it until it happens to, like it did to Ms. Bartlett.
Mike Burg, you handle these cases, pharmaceutical drug company, time after time. It's the same story. The drug company phonies up clinical data. They hide the truth from doctors. They hide the truth from consumers. And then FDA is there for them, protecting them. What does this process leave? What kind of protection does the consumer have at all in a setting like that? What do you tell a person who has lost a child or lost a family member because of a bad drug? It happens to be a generic drug, therefore you don't have a lawsuit against the generic company.
Well, first of all, that's a hard thing to say, but we all have to do it from time to time. And what I try to tell them is, look, it's what's going on in the system. It's the administration. It's the FDA. Write your congressman. You know what? If we can get Congress, and I agree with Howard, they may not be ready to pass the bill, but if the pressure's put on the administration from the Democrats in the House and in the Senate, maybe we can get the administration to move on this. People have to get up and shout, we're not going to take this. We're not going to allow this to happen. They have to do something, because otherwise we're going to have children dying, people who are catastrophically injured, and they're going to have no recourse because the pharmaceutical company has got their fingers in the till with the FDA, promising jobs to people at the FDA when they get out of the FDA. We know that as a fact. We know people are basically leaving the FDA and getting big money jobs with big pharma. It all has to stop, and we have to make it stop.
Howard Nations, you have been somebody who's been up front on behalf of consumers since as long as I've known you. If consumers knew what your history is on behalf of them, they'd be very proud to listen to what you have to say. In this setting, you actually went to Washington on many occasions. You were one of the chief lobbyists on against the drug companies' effort to do away with protection for consumers. What do you make of this president? What is it that we just so poorly misjudged about this president?
The only thing I can say is if you look at the mincing case, which happened before the election, the administration sided with the consumer. when we tried to meet with the FDA to discuss this, they said, well, let's wait till after the election. We don't want to do anything on this until after the election. And then after the election, now that it's coming up again, same issue is coming up again. The administration is now siding with the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, so what we see, Howard, sometimes you see drug cases, the actual, it shouldn't be just damages, people should go to jail. But we have an administration, obviously under the hand of the Department of Justice, that is not willing to, their opinion is that if a corporation's too big, we can't prosecute them at all. But in this situation, it's even worse than that. We have an administration that says, no, not only do we not want to prosecute them, we don't even want to be held accountable financially. Let me ask you this, Howard. You got 1 minute. Let me leave it with you. What is it that we do about this? What can be done?
Well, the thing that was most depressing about this, not only is the administration supporting the pharmaceutical industry on this, but the Solicitor General actually requested time from the U.S. Supreme Court to argue, oral argument, by the government on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies. Absolutely outrageous. The only thing that can be done about this is pressure on the administration, because the only people that are going to fix this, unfortunately, are the FDA. Public Citizen is trying, American Trial Lawyers is trying, various lobbyists for consumers are trying hard to bring pressure. We have senators who are trying, they're sending letters over to the FDA. They're getting no response. A new bill has been proposed in the United States Senate, which is just a one-paragraph bill which would solve this problem, but it won't solve the problem either.
I am glad you and Mike Burg are out front on this. Keep up the good work. Keep up the fight. We can only ask that this president deliver on some of the promises he gave us while he was running. Thanks.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll take a look at the increasingly violent actions of the Tea Party fringe. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Last week, another story emerged where a Tea Party type was gunned down after a standoff with police officers. The man claimed to be a sovereign citizen. It's a group that's growing in numbers. Joining me now to talk about the rise of the Tea Party type fringe hate groups and their violent nature is Heidi Byrich from the Southern Poverty Law Center. Heidi, thank goodness for the Southern Poverty Law Center. We'd never know these stories. We'd never see that there's a trend taking place in the U.S. right now where you have hate groups at an all-time high. It seems like every time Obama opens his mouth about guns, every time he talks about immigration, every time he talks about anything that the crazy right wing doesn't want to hear, they arm themselves a little bit more. What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, you're right. It's been really, really bad out there in right-wing extremist circles since Obama came into office. We've got more hate groups than we ever had, over 1,000, and we've had an absolute explosion of anti-government groups, particularly in the wake of the discussions over gun control. And the rhetoric is extremely angry. There's been a lot of violence coming from the sector, so the situation is quite serious.
What are the combinations of events, Heidi, that's bringing all this about? As far as what you've followed with the Southern Poverty Law Center, what types of trends are bringing this about?
Sure. Well, the growth in hate groups has been going on for about a decade, and a lot of that is being propelled by the increasing diversity in the United States, in particular the growth of the Latino population. Obviously, if you're a white supremacist, that's not going to sit very well with you. So hate groups have been feeding on that. But the bad economy and the election of the first African-American president in particular are the main forces behind the recent jumps in the number of these organizations.
Isn't part of the problem, Heidi, the fact that you have traditional media taking these Looney Tune talking points, what we used to just refer to as absolute crazy talk, and now they're making it part of the public discussion, as if these are relevant, as if they're wise, as if it's something we need to really talk about. Don't you see that being driven some part, at least, by traditional media?
There is no question. Things that used to remain siloed over in the crazy right wing have made it onto TV now. in particular as the result of Fox News and other online sites that are popular in conservative circles. So extremist conspiracy theories are being found in what people call the mainstream. Maybe we shouldn't, but they're on TV, they're on cable, and it's really scary because a lot of people who are watching this stuff can't separate fact from fiction, and they think that because it's on so-called mainstream venues that it must be true.
In other words, this used to be mud wrestling, tractor pull, world wrestling kind of stuff. We'd say, okay, yeah, that's crazy. That's some crazy stuff going on out there. But we're not even gonna spend a lot of time talking about it because it's such a disconnect from democracy and reality within our democracy. But right now, you have a media that is anxious to embrace it and actually justify it in a lot of ways. And out of there, we're seeing something called the sovereign citizens movement that's become stronger and stronger. Talk about that movement. Most people don't even know what it is. When they hear about it, they say, Pap, that really can't be real. It is real, isn't it?
Well, the sovereign citizens movement has absolutely exploded in the course of the last few years, since Obama came into office, basically. And these are people who believe that the federal government has absolutely no right to ask them to use driver's licenses, to license their vehicles, to have social security cards, marriage licenses, death certificates, you name it. They think that the government has no power over them. And what's more scary about these people, not just that they have these crazy anti-government beliefs, is that there's been a lot of violence coming from these folks, in particular against law enforcement. Law enforcement officers have been shot by people who believe in sovereign citizens ideology. Just 2 weeks ago in North Florida, you had a man that was gunned down by the SWAT team because he had shot at the police and was actually willing to engage in whatever violence was necessary to get his idea across that he's a sovereign citizen. A, he doesn't have to pay taxes. B, he doesn't have to have a driver's license. C, he's not really a member of the United States according to him. D, we could go on forever. He has his own money. This is a story where he actually tried to pay for a car repair with some money that he had created because he thought that this was his money that the government had hidden from him. Tell that story a little bit because people don't understand just how crazy the sovereign citizens movement is. What is this about the right to own this money that they say has been taken from them? Yeah, sovereign citizens believe that the federal government is holding a secret bank account in their names. It's called a straw man account. It has, in some cases, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 or even more in it. And then if you file the right paperwork that they make up, phony, bogus paperwork, you can get access to this supposed account that is being hidden from you by the federal government. In addition, sovereign citizens really think they can print their own money, bogus bonds, other forms and instruments of currency, and that they can just go ahead and use it in the way it happened in North Florida to pay their bills.
What is the Affidavit of Reservations of Rights? Talk about how does this fit together? What is this thing? How do these sovereign citizens learn about it? Why do they think that yes, they can be a sovereign unto themselves, that they don't need a country? They can determine everything about what they want that sovereign country to look like. What is this Affidavit of Reservation of Rights that they rely on?
Well, that affidavit is just one of several different instruments, including things called letters of marque and UCC filings, various of those in which they assert their rights to do basically whatever the heck that they want to do. And the way they find out about these documents is they attend seminars. They're held all over the country in which you're told by these seminar folks, these sort of sovereign gurus, how you have all kinds of rights that the government has withheld from you. And if you file things like these affidavits or letters of marque, that you can access things like money, or you can force other individuals or government officers to give you money. It's very complicated how this is done. There's a lot of this documentation. It looks like gobbledygook for the most part, but it's something that they use, and they often use it to harass government officials.
And one thing that we see happening is we see these stories that are out there, created again and propelled by mainstream media. For example, the story that Obama had a UN army that was going to come to the United States and take everybody's guns, or that Obama had a camp that he was going to put conservative teabaggers in if they didn't toe the line. There were FEMA trailers that supposedly he had put a concentration camp together. The stories are endless, but unfortunately this fringe, this very Looney Tune, kooky fringe, they embrace those stories as real. Don't you find that as you followed all this?
Oh, absolutely. There literally are, it's probably more than 1 million people in this country who believe Obama is imminently about to round us up and put us in FEMA camps. They even spread diagrams of these things. Glenn Beck had this stuff on his TV program a while back of where these camps are all over the country. And people really believe this, and it's motivating. And the problem about it is it's getting people organized into anti-government groups, it's getting them paranoid, and they're getting armed. And that's a combustible mix that's coming out of the fact that these kinds of crazy conspiracy theories are finding their way into mainstream venues.
Well, now we have a setting to where it's tough sometimes for me to tell the difference between a Tea Partier and one of these sovereign citizens. I mean, sometimes the lines just seem, there is no line. It seems like they are just an extension of the Tea Party. Is there some element to that, or am I just reading too much into what's happening here?
Well, I mean, look, all of those sectors, all those folks that you just mentioned are people who share extreme anti-government beliefs. And so you see these ideas bleeding from one venue to the other to the other. I mean, the Tea Parties, for the most part, aren't as kooky as the sovereign citizens, but if they're on a continuum, right? And you do find some of these conspiracy theories right there in the heart of Tea Partydom, as well as in the sovereign citizens world.
What we see in so much of the South, of course, it is like a gaggle of crazy down here with these hate groups in the South. You're in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm in North Florida. If you go Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Texas, right through, that is where you have this huge gaggle of these crazies. Why is that? I know that they're strong throughout the country, but why is it that we're seeing so much of that in the South?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that the backlash against the Obama administration is much stronger in, parts of the Old South. And the reaction has been much more fierce. And you are absolutely right. The kind of density of hate groups down here, the number of sovereign citizens are much higher than in other parts of the country. And this has to do with the fact that the South is traditionally more conservative, and there are places easier to get a foothold with some of these ideas. Not to say that they're not all across the country, but there definitely are more of them in the Old South.
You see this bleeding in, not just from the Tea Party, you see it bleeding in to the GOP. I mean, if you take a look at this last week, Rick Perry comes on stage and talks about the need to embrace Latinos at CPAC, and everybody starts booing him. And what is the target? Is it immigration? Is it the right to own guns? Is it the fact that we have an African-American president? What is it that drives them the most when you see these hate groups arise so quickly, and so many in the Southeast especially?
Well, look, immigration has been an absolutely massive factor, in places like Alabama have passed punishing laws against the undocumented population down here. That is a big, big issue. But the thing that has made people go really crazy lately has been this discussion about gun control. I mean, we've got people from these movements literally going on videos on YouTube saying they're going to start killing people. So that's been the biggest trigger in the last couple of months.
What if you were to put a number on the number of organizations that you would say that fall into that kind of hate group? What do the numbers look like today as we sit and have this conversation?
Well, there are 1,007 hate groups across the country. That is a number that is up from 602 in 2000, a massive, massive jump over that time period. But the anti-government groups have been growing even quicker, and entirely under the time that Obama's been in office. They went from 149 of those groups to 1,360. That tells you something about the quickness of the growth in the extreme anti-government organizations.
You hear, and I think there's some truth to this, Heidi, I want to know your opinion on it, that most of these people are, it's out of fear, that you have these people that, these big tough guys carrying guns, and they're a member of the Patriot Group and the militia, you name it. But if you really analyze them if you were to take an MMPI and have a psychologist analyze them, that the underpinning of that person is they're damned afraid of everything, that fear drives this crazy edge that we see taking place, that this Bruce Willis type character who says, yeah, I'm a tough guy, I can shoot an AK-47, I'm a member of the militia. When you really drill down, fear, really crazy fear, is at the heart of that person. What's your take on that?
Yeah, you've got it in a nutshell. These people are terrified. They're terrified of cultural changes. Immigration stands out to them on that. They see Obama in the White House and they can't understand how that could have happened. They're terrified. I mean, some of these people really think they're going to get rounded up. It's not like they're insane. They have come to believe that this is an imminent threat to their families. And this is why the gun issue is so volatile, because they think it's the last thing that they have to protect themselves from all these terrible things that are coming down the pipe. Fear is the exact right word to describe these movements.
Unfortunately, what we see in about 20 seconds or less, we see the GOP buying into it. Last number I saw, 25% who found themselves registered as GOP said that that it was okay for states to secede from the United States. That's a scary number in of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what we found was that the far right of the Republican Party harbors a lot of these ideas, and it's quite terrifying.
Heidi, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being out there doing your job.
Thanks.
Coming up, we'll have the latest on the fight to preserve America's social safety nets. I'm Mike Papantonio. We're going to be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. President Obama has made it clear that he's open to cutting essential programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid as part of an ugly, ugly deal with the Republicans. Rather than standing up for the New Deal and the millions who depend on it, Obama's willing to scrap it. Joining me now to talk about this is progressive radio host Richard Fowler. So, Richard, you have now Biden. Everybody remembers the Biden speech where he's out on the circuit and he says, you know what, I can guarantee you that this administration will not be doing anything to mess with Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. We're not going to mess with any of that. He guaranteed the American public that. Now, is it possible that the President of the United States, President Obama, didn't know that his vice president was making out guarantees like that? Because he sure is not living up to those words, is he, Richard?
Well, I probably think the president either was unaware or at the time being during the election to where we are now, it's a different set of circumstances, unfortunately, Pap. I think what we've seen from this Republican Party is a Republican Party that's unwilling to budge whatsoever to the detriment of the American people and the middle and working class in this country.
But don't you think that to come after the safety nets is something that he should not do because he runs the risk of alienating the progressives? Look, he made a promise. He comes to the American public and he promises them, I'm not going to mess with this. It's almost like, if you think about it, Richard, isn't it very similar to George Bush, Senior Bush, when Senior Bush said, read my lips, no new taxes. And he had to live with that, and it destroyed so many people it destroyed their faith in the Republican movement, not just that particular president. Don't we run the risk of doing that if they tell us one thing day one and then day two we see something completely different?
Well, I think you're completely right on this, Pap. I think what we'll see, the president, he has to really walk a tight line when it comes to reforming social safety nets in this country, because the more reforms he does, the more he alienates middle class and working class families, and beyond even alienating them, the worse their lives are. I mean, you look at the Paul Ryan budget and what it sort of prescribed to do for working class, cutting Head Start, cutting Pell Grants, cutting WIC programs, the social safety nets that we depend on in this country to get back on our feet. You understand why they're so important. And you look at our economic downturn, you also see why they're so important. Why I think I personally believe the president's sort of putting out an olive branch to see if Republicans are even willing to come along on, even if he gives something. I don't think he should give anything, but I think that's sort of the move here.
But Richard, didn't we just see this several months ago where we saw what I call the olive branch switcheroo? That's where they come out with their olive branch on filibuster. Remember, Harry Reid gets pulled into that. Oh yeah, you just work with us on filibuster. The Republicans were telling Harry this, they were telling the president this. Just work with us on filibuster. Don't reform anything, and we'll work with you. How many times do we have to be a victim to that? That's what's so bothersome about that to me, Richard.
No, I hear you. I think you're completely right. On the filibuster argument, I think Harry Reid was completely and totally off base. We should have reformed the filibuster point blank, period. But I think where we saw the artfulness and the communication skills of the president was on this whole chain CPI. He brought it out. It's almost like show and tell. He brought it out to the American people. We automatically rejected it. Nobody in Congress was going to vote on it. He sort of tainted it, and then he pulled it back in and ended up not using it. And I think that is probably the strategy that the White House is going for from a communication lens, to sort of bring rope the Republicans in and then trap them in their own tangled web of lies.
What we know about change CPI is this, that it's a fraud. We know that the whole argument about change CPI is an utter fraud. And the words should never be coming out of this president's mouth. Here's what we know. We know that the change CPI evaluation is based on an inflation movement that is complete fantasy. They're trying to suggest you have the government now trying to suggest, gee whiz, inflation isn't as bad as we thought it was, and you can trust our numbers on change CPI, therefore don't be afraid of us cutting Social Security. I mean, that's really how bizarre the argument is. And isn't that another credibility problem that the administration runs a risk of if they try to shove this down our throats?
Well, you're right, Pap. The administration does run a credibility problem if they decide to sort of shove change CPI down the American people's throat, or shove, changes to the social safety net down the American people's throat. But where the president is artful, and I think where we could sort of see what a true, real communicator does, is he put the argument out there, sort of beta tested it. The American people and progressives automatically rejected it. People on the right rejected it. It tainted it for both sides, and we ended up it wasn't in the deal whatsoever. So I think he's talking about entitlement reform to sort of rope the Republicans in. It's like, yeah, entitlement reform, and then they're sort of left with the bag of stolen goods at the end of the robbery.
Do you worry in about a minute, Richard? Tell me, do you worry that you have a president believing that this is going to go bad for the Republicans? Don't you worry this is going to go bad for this president and the Democrats in the next election if you don't have a president that shows some real courage and leadership here?
Well, the one thing I worry about is I think at any time you play these high-risk, high-stake poker games that we're playing with this Republican Party, you always worry about how the American people are going to look and how the American people are going to view it. But what we have seen from recent polling, Pap, and recent messaging work is that all polls show that the American people they're squarely on the side of the President of the United States, and they don't think that they don't trust the Republicans in handling fiscal issues or handling the budget. So I think that's where the president wins on this argument. I think he'd come out, say this is what we need to get done. Whatever Republicans say is automatically tainted by the fact that nobody trusts them to run the budget to begin with. And I think you have a really good situation, a really good setup for the president to do a really good job in the election of 2014 and sort of possibly win back the House and maintain the Senate.
Well, let's see. He's going to have to stand firm on this if he wants to do that. I'm completely convinced of that. Richard Fowler, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much, Pat.
The FDA announced last week that one of the most widely prescribed antibiotics in America has been shown to cause heart problems in patients. The product's still on the market, so consumers need to use extreme caution. I've got attorney Ben Gordon here to talk about the dangers of the Z-Pack. Ben, let's hope the FDA doesn't drop the ball again on this new case. It's the Z-Pack, the dangers of the antibiotic Z-Pack. Tell us about the new studies that are coming out, the new information about Z-Pack.
Well, unfortunately, with Zithromax, we've known for some time that this class of medications is problematic, and the FDA, as you said, has sat on the sidelines and done nothing about it until just recently. Finally, they have forced the likes of Pfizer and other companies manufacturing and marketing these drugs, including generic companies wholly owned by Pfizer, to do the right thing and to warn people that these things cause a sudden risk of arrhythmias, a sudden risk of electrical disturbance of the heart, which can kill you.
Okay, and so how long? Tell us about this product a little bit. It's so ubiquitous. People, everybody gets a Z-Pack when they have some type of infection. It's almost like when they don't feel good, docs, oh, you need a Z-Pack. It's basically all over the market, isn't it?
It's a catchphrase that it sounds so easy and innocuous that, oh, all you got to do is take a Z-Pack. And that's the way the companies have marketed it. They've said, look, you can take this drug for 5 days. You don't have to take it for weeks. You don't have to take it for 30 days. Well, why is that a good thing? Because they give you such a strong dose of medication, it stays in your bloodstream so long that it's toxic. It's an antibiotic. These drugs that everyone thinks are so innocent and so innocuous are very good at killing things, and unfortunately they stay in your bloodstream so long. With some people, they cause sudden electrical disturbance and can kill you, and the FDA is only now stepping up to tell the public that this class of drugs is dangerous.
What is what is that disturbance of the heart? How does it go about actually causing injury or death?
The truth is we don't know the full range of complications that may evolve from this class of medications, but we do know that it definitely causes a QT elongation, or prolongation of the QT portion of the electrical rhythm of the heart, which is what can cause sudden disturbance of the heart function. If that portion of the heart's rhythm is prolonged too much, then your heart stops beating regularly and can stop and you die suddenly. I got off the phone 2 hours ago with a 23-year-old here in Pensacola, Florida, whose heart suddenly stopped and he almost died. His heart today, a couple of weeks later, is performing at 20% what his heart should be functioning. His ejection fraction is 20%, and he's 23 years old.
Ben, looking at this case, when should the warnings have gone up to the American public saying, you need to pay attention to this stuff that can stop your heart?
Well, we don't know how far back it goes as the truth, Pap. We're going to have to get into Pfizer's files. It's kind of like the Trovan. You remember the Trovan catastrophe that they kept so quiet? I mean, people forget about that. It happened in 1996 in Nigeria. They killed children in Nigeria because they were expendable, because it was Africa, marketing another antibiotic. They didn't know about the dangers of it, so they experimented on African children, killed dozens of children in Africa, and only last year, 2 years ago, did they settle that, kept it quiet and settled it for $75 million.
Pfizer has a long history of not playing by the rules. As a matter of fact, the last time I looked in 2009, Pfizer was hit for $2.3 billion to resolve criminal and civil allegations that they were illegally. I mean, just the law was there, black and white. They chose to take the illegal angle on it and promote 4 different kinds of drugs. They also were caught using off-label uses for their drugs. What is off-label use, and why is it a crime to do that?
Exactly. It's a huge problem because the drug company wants to get their drugs into the hands of as many people as they can, and they'll get their reps to do whatever they have to do to get those drugs into doctors' hands and into patients' mouths. So they will market a drug for an indication that they haven't even tested, that they have no science on, they have no clinical data, no efficacy to say that that drug is efficacious or is beneficial for that purpose, but they'll give that drug, maybe even a higher dose than what they tested in the studies. They'll give it to these pretty little cheerleaders and these athletes, and they'll get them to peddle it to these doctors, and the doctors are fat, dumb, and happy and don't even suspect a problem because they weren't involved in the clinical trials, and they will give it to these cheerleaders. The cheerleaders will take it into the doctor and say, here, use this for anything you want. We'll give you a list of things you can use it for, even though it hasn't been tested, proven safe, or effective for that indication.
Ben, didn't Pfizer, weren't they also held accountable for, I think it was about $105 million fine? And it was a product called Bextra where they did basically that. They used it in an off-label kind of way. They knew they were breaking the law. They did it anyway. What is it about, I mean, you've worked against this company for so long. What is it that we see a drug company time and time again getting away with the same thing with really no downside?
Well, that's what's sad about it, Pap. And you go back farther than anybody in this industry and know all the way back to the asbestos days and the thalidomide days and the exploding gas tank Pinto days. It's a cost of doing business. It's a corporate culture of evilness and a mentality that if we can make more money doing it before they catch us, we'll pay $1 billion criminal fine. We'll pay $100 million in civil fines for a Bextra because you know what? We're going to make $6, $8, $10, $12 billion before anybody catches us. A company that could buy up other companies for $68 billion a couple of years ago. They bought Wyeth, I think it was. You know, a company with those kinds of assets will do whatever it takes to preserve those resources to make billions of dollars, even if they have to pay occasional fines.
They just crunch the numbers. The accountant says, yeah, we can kill X number of people and still make a profit. Ben Gordon,
it's a cost of doing business.
Ben Gordon, thank you for joining me. Keep up with this story. We'll stay in touch.
Great work, Pap. Thanks.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and I'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.